Finally, Unit 3, after the great COVID scare of 2021. It's Unit 3, the great gig in the sky. What is the great gig in the sky? It's God, right? And religion. And I bring to you a little Pink Floyd off of the great Dark Side of the Moon album, the song The Great Gig in the Sky. Give it a listen for a second. It's a pretty little ditty. It's a pretty ditty. It starts out real slow, then it starts to build with some seriously awesome voice as instrument. Here's where it starts kicking. A slide guitar. And so here we go. We're going to ask the question, what is a religion? Right? What does it mean? What does it all mean? What does it mean to be religious? Kill the music there. And, religion's kind of an interesting thing because we have all these different social scientists that have weighed in on the concepts. And of course, a lot of different opinions and theories here. Let's start with just the sort of cultural aspect here. Culturally, an anthropologist studies culture. Culturally, what is a religion? When we talk about this is a religion, what do we really mean? What do we really mean culturally? This has a great influence on the way people live. It influences the way people live. Now, religion is a subcategory of culture. So if we had a big culture pie, right, religion, there's food and clothing and music, and religion is going to be a piece of this culture pie. And the reason, of course, religion is a part of our culture is because it influences the way that we live as people. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples, right? Examples that you might not have really thought of. Something like brushing your teeth and showering. These are things that we do. This is the way we live, right? We brush our teeth 2-3 times a day, once after every meal. We shower. Probably adults in the United States shower once a day. Brushing your teeth, showering. Why do we behave like this? Well, believe it or not, it actually has a religious tie. The early founders of the United States, those pilgrims, the original settlers of what is today the United States, were pilgrims. And what does that mean to be a pilgrim? It meant that you followed the Christian religion of Puritanism, right? What we would today call the Wesleyan or Calvinist Church of Jesus Christ. They are Christian, but more specifically, they were Puritan. And that word Puritan, these were people that thought that cleanliness was holiness, right? And if you were clean, you were holy. And if you died clean, then you would have a better chance of getting into heaven. And so something as simple as brushing your teeth or showering a few times a day actually has a religious root to why we live that way, which is probably something we never really think of, okay? So that's just one example of how a religion can influence the way people live. I'm going to erase this little piece here to make some more room for my sociology chart here. This is probably the big one. If we really wanted to focus on what is a religion, this is probably key, right? Because a sociologist is going to study human interaction, and there are things that mimic or model religion. And we refer to those sort of mimics as a cult, right? And so we want to be able to differentiate between a religion and a cult. And a sociologist would, through their studies, really be able to hone in on, okay, well, this is religious and this is just cult-like behavior. Let's kind of explore the difference between a religion and a cult. One, the idea that there is some sort of supreme being or God. So a religion, check, is going to have a supreme being or a God that people worship, or a set of gods. Ooh, it's supposed to be an S, right? Plural. A cult also has a supreme leader or being, right? And if I can think of, I always make fun of Mr. Strong with CrossFit. I mean, what isn't fun to make fun of there, right? We always like to make fun of Mr. Strong in CrossFit. I always say, hey, Mr. Strong, you're in a cult, man. CrossFit is a cult. Why? Because they have a supreme leader, right? CrossFit has a leader, and everything the leader says to do is like, that's the supreme way to do it. And CrossFit sort of meets that criteria, but CrossFit certainly is not a religion. Number two, most religions have some sort of a geographic origin. Most of our three major religions come out of the Semitic area of the Middle East, which we'll get to when we cover each of them individually. But most religions have some sort of geographic tie to a geographic area. That's not to say that it can't spread beyond that geographic area, right? But most religions have some type of geographic origin. So for instance, Hinduism is one of the religions that we're going to cover, and we're going to see that Hinduism develops in India, right? And that's the geographic area that Hinduism is tied to. Shintoism is from Japan, right? The three Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all come out of the Middle East. And so religions have some sort of geographic origin, right? Cults, I don't know, do cults have a geographic origin? Where did CrossFit start? Here in the United States, out on the West Coast. Yep, okay. So boom, check. A cult can also have sort of a geographic origin. And so it gets really hard to differentiate between a religion and a cult because they start to look the same. Here's another one. Religions have some sort of holy texts or truths that members are supposed to follow. A holy text or a truth. And religions have those holy texts, and cults also have sort of those holy texts that people follow. And here's where we start to get into some questionable differences. A religion has we've talked about a hierarchy, right? A social pyramid. A hierarchy of priests. And a religion has a hierarchy of priests, and cults sometimes do not. We're going to put a question mark here, right? If I drew the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, for instance, I would have the Pope on top, and then there would all be these cardinals and bishops, and then the lower levels of the church right down to the local parishioners, and you could really draw the social pyramid of the Catholic Church. That qualifies it as a religion. If I drew the hierarchy of CrossFit, I don't know how defined that hierarchy is. Now, I'm not in CrossFit, but some cults don't necessarily have a hierarchy. Sometimes it's just everything begins and ends with their leader, and there isn't really sort of subordinates, if you will. But here's the big one, right? Here's the big difference between a religion and a cult. Religions are inherited. Meaning, like, if you're Jewish, it's because your mother was Jewish. If you're Christian, it's generally because your parents were Christian. Now, you can convert in, but your original religion is with you when you are born. You do not necessarily make the decision to belong, generally, with an actual religion. It is something that is inherited. If you are, and this is very, very key in Hinduism when we get there, whatever social class your Hindu parents belong to, that's the social class that you belong to. It's totally determined by your inheritance and who your parents are. And so that qualifies as a religion, whereas cults, no, right? Cults have more of a choosing to belong, right? I make the choice to belong to this group maybe later in life. Or I can make the choice to leave the group, right? I mean, I'm Catholic. I can't necessarily stop being Catholic. This is the way I inherited it. I was raised this way. My parents brought me to church every weekend. Like, it is a part of who I am. Even when I make the choice to stop going to church, I can't undo this, okay? Whereas with cults, there's more of I'm choosing to belong later in life, or I am choosing to try and leave. And generally, choosing to try and leave, leaving in a cult is discouraged. Whereas if I choose to leave the Catholic Church, nobody comes to stop me, right? The priest doesn't come to my house and say, hey, look, I really want you to stay in the church. Like, it's never discouraged, right? With a religion, if I try to leave my inherited religion, I have the freedom to do so. Whereas with cults, leaving becomes very discouraged. Okay? So that's sort of the sociological difference between a religion and a cult. Let's shift over here, finally, looking at things from a psychological point of view. You know, why does the human brain sort of create these afterlife stories? Why do we create religious afterlives? And psychologists theorize on this a little bit. Oops, that's supposed to be a T. Psychologists say, well, number one, why is our brain so drawn to this idea of an afterlife? Well, it could have to do with us being the only species that can project ourselves into the future. Right? So we can imagine ourselves at 70 years old. We can imagine ourselves in the future and what we're going to be like in the future. And so we also imagine ourselves and what things are going to be like after we pass away. So we can actually project the future and we can imagine what we look like in the future. And to psychologists' beliefs, we're the only creatures on Earth that can actually do that, right? Your cat is not projecting what it's going to be when it's 12 years old, right? It doesn't happen. Whereas humans, we do have the ability to project the future. There's some other psychological possibilities too with the way our brain works. Not only are we the only species that can project into the future, but we also encounter from a really young age, mom and dad seem super smart. And super strong compared to our little selves. And so perhaps we have this idea that there is a God because the first people that we really encounter in life are almost these godlike superior beings. And so as we become more superior and smarter and stronger, we only imagine that there must be something else that's even more smart and knowledgeable and even stronger than we are even as adults. And so we get that modeled from a young age that there's always something super smart or super strong that's better than us that's out there. And then last but not least, some psychologists believe that we have this idea of a dualism. That we like to think that our body is just like a vessel. We have our body and then we have our spirit. And our spirit doesn't necessarily go to the same spot as our body does. And so this idea of dualism might be another psychological reason why humans create these sort of religious afterlife stories. All food for thought, right? We've got the basic, you know what? An anthropologist is going to say a religion just influences the way that we live and kind of gives us rules to live by. A sociologist is going to say there's really specific things that meet the criteria of a religion as opposed to a cult. And a psychologist is going to say, well, this is the way our brain works. Psychologically, we developed this idea that there must be some sort of a God or religious element to the world that we live in. So some different possibilities to consider. That's it for today. Just kind of a little intro lesson to get our brains wiggling on the great gig in the sky. Thanks for joining. Great to be back to school. If you're watching this video several years from now, there's the bell. It's time to go. But if you're watching this video several years from now, and I'm talking about having COVID and recovering from COVID, you're not even going to know what that means. I'll have to teach you later.